Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy you could join us today for Deep Roots Native Plants at Noon. I'm your host, Cydney Ross. I'm the Outdoor Education Manager here for Deep Roots, and we have a great show for you today. With the weather outside being slightly frightful, we have a delightful series of tips and tricks to discuss about winter sowing. So if your mind is telling you, wait, I probably shouldn't plant yet, but your body's saying yes, give into that urge, because I'm giving you permission to start your Missouri native or Midwestern native seeds outside this winter. But before we begin, I have just a couple announcements to make. First, I want to thank you, our viewers, for joining us, whether this is your first time tuning in for Native Plants at Noon or you are a recurring viewer. Your support means a lot to me and our team here at Deep Roots in order to bring educational content to viewers like you. And I also want to give a big thank you to the Missouri Department of Conservation for making this series possible. I also appreciate that they like to encourage our citizens to get outdoors and experience nature. And if you enjoy our programs like this webinar and more, you should check out Planet Native, which is just a month away. We're back live in Kansas City on February 15th and 16th, and we have a great series of programs for you. I am very excited about Cheryl Salentino, Learn the Land, a fresh approach to site analysis. If you've ever watched any of the presentations I've given, you know that planning is a really good idea, in my opinion, unless you're a plopper, like some people I know. And Cheryl does a great job of diving into this with her program for Planet Native. And understanding the land on which we interject our ideas offers the very information needed to make these ecologically sound choices. So join us for Planet Native. Register today because tickets are selling out fast. And don't forget, during our program today, add to the conversation in our chat and put your questions in the Q&A. After we discuss these winter sowing tips from the Discovery Center, we'll jump into a healthy Q&A conversation. So please add to that conversation. We would love to hear from you. And also, don't forget, if you've missed any of our episodes, we have our archive online at deeproots.org. You can also view upcoming events, webinars, native gardening resources, and more. And while you're there, consider making a donation to continue our educational programming. All right, like I said, we have a wonderful show for you today. So let's go ahead and dive in to Native Plants at Noon, Winter Sowing at the Discovery Center. Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for Native Plants at Noon. That's Ephraim and I'm Cydney, and we're super excited to talk about winter sowing today. Now Ephraim, have you ever done winter sowing?
I have not, so I'm anxious to see what this is all about.
That's so exciting. Well, Ephraim is one of our native landscape specialists here at the Discovery Center. He started last summer, and we're excited to come into winter and talk about all the things we can do gardening-wise in the winter. So.
Yes, interesting.
All right, here we go. Okay, so before we head outside, I want to talk a little bit about winter sowing. Now, wintertime is a great time to sow native seeds into your landscape, but even better to start them in a little greenhouse type container. So Ephraim and I are going to show you today how to winter sow in recycled plastic jugs, takeaway containers, lunch or salad dishes, things like that, and then where to place them outside, how to maintain them. And also we're going to show you how to sow seed into an already prepared garden bed. So even though there's a lot of snow on the ground in Kansas City right now, there are tons of gardening things you can do at home. So, and one of the reasons winter sowing works so well for our native plants is oftentimes here in the Midwest, our native plants have evolved to require something called a cold moist stratification. Now that's a big fancy word for these plants need to go through winter time, get snowed on, get moist, and freeze in order to germinate the following spring. So Mother Nature's got this under control. They've been doing this for thousands of years. So this is a really great way to start your own seeds in an affordable way from your home. So the first things you need are some recycled containers. So I'm going to grab them from here. I've got a few different options to pick from. So I do want to show you, these are ideal containers, like this takeout container that has a lid. It already has like a hinge on it, so that's really convenient. Even like a blueberry container, again, that attached lid, it's already got holes in the bottom and the top. Egg cartons would be great too if you wanted to do some different species, maybe like a couple plants in each and transfer them into a larger container later. But some options that are not great, well, one, if your plastic is old, be careful when you're poking holes in it not to hurt yourself, right? So if you run into something like this, like I did the other day, I'd recommend you actually get like a nail and heat it up a little bit, and then you can drive holes into the plastic without potentially harming yourself. So that would be one thing to keep an eye out for. Also, containers like this chives container or an herb container, much too small for our native seeds. We want them to have enough depth so that we can fill them with soil, and that the seeds can start to develop their roots. So we've got our containers. I'm going to demonstrate with a couple here. So first I'll actually start with this egg carton. So again, I mentioned this egg carton is a really great option if you are wanting to try out, maybe you want to test to see how well these seeds germinate during winter sowing. So you could do, 24, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, nope, 12, a dozen eggs, 12 different species in here if you'd like. Today I'm going to show you a few different, just 3 species. And so first, what I recommend, get that paper out of here, because you do want a clear top. That was harder than I thought it was going to be. You want a clear top in your container, because it's essentially a mini greenhouse. You're creating an atmosphere in here. When the sun hits it, it'll warm up the seeds when the time is right. And with the holes cut in the top, it allows for that moisture to come through. So I just would take, if it's an easy plastic to cut through like this was, you can cut into the top directly. Ephraim already did this for me earlier, using an X-Acto knife or a sharp blade. Or again, try that hot nail trick, and just be careful not to burn your fingers when you do that. So this is a good option. I'm gonna go ahead, so it's already got holes in the bottom of each little section and in the top. And I'm just gonna make sure I know which way is up so I don't accidentally fill the wrong side. So this soil that I have here is a mix, it's pretty much potting soil. It also has a little bit of seed starting soil in it. And I chose that soil because it's what we have here at the Discovery Center. Now I would really recommend you use what you have on hand. Recycled soil would be great, any kind of potting soil that you have. I am trying to move away from potting soils that have sphagnum peat moss, because it's an unsustainable material to harvest. And I'll give you more resources on that in the email following the show if you'd like to learn more. But these are some options that we have here at the Discovery Center. So, okay, I filled up my container with soil, and now I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle my seeds into each little section. So the seeds we're starting with today are Missouri native seeds. So here I have Penstemon digitalis, which is foxglove beard tongue. If you like bumblebee butts in the spring, this is a great plant. With the big white tubular flowers, it really is attractive to our spring pollinators like bumblebees. And I love the way these seeds look, because they're just like little flecks of dried clay. It really looks like that to me. I'll let you get a close up in there. So what I'm gonna do, since this for me, I'm gonna use this container as a way to test the germination rate of these plants. So I'm just sprinkling a few seeds. Like, you won't even be able to see them from the camera, but trust that I'm putting anywhere from 3 to 4 seeds into each spot. Okay, so that is for the Penstemon. And I'm doing more penstemon because this year, one of my goals in the greenhouse is to grow more of that. Sorry, I keep calling it penstemon, it's foxglove. Both names are for the same plant, but just not trying to use so much jargon. But yeah, so I want to grow more foxglove in the landscape this year, and this is one way that we're going to try to do that. Some other plants that we're growing are going to be columbine. Oh, I just love the seeds. Look at that. It looks like they're really oily and tiny, smooth. They're so cool. I'll actually pour some in my hand too so you can really see that. Oh yeah, look at that. So again, a few seeds go a long way, and as you know, buying plugs can be very expensive, especially if you have a native landscaping problem like I do. So growing from seed like this can be really affordable and kind of a cool way to learn more about the plants. So this is a lot of seed, so I'm not going to use all of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a couple of here and a few right there. Okay, and I'll save that last section for my third species. Oh, and the seeds are sticking to my hand now, but that's okay. All right, just add those right back in there. And for our final native plant in this container, I'm going to do purple coneflower, quintessential plant for the native garden, a wonderful species that supports songbirds throughout the year, and that a lot of our tiny little native bees, like our metallic green sweat bee, they overwinter in the stems, which is very cool. So I always like to have purple coneflower in my garden, even if it's considered kind of a basic plant to some. I don't mean that as an insult for me personally. I love this plant. Okay, so yeah, just a few seeds there. Now that is ready to go. Now I would recommend you label. So how does one label these plants if we're going to set them outside? Because over the years I've done winter sowing, and the Sharpie written on the outside or on tape does not work. So what I recommend, in this case, you could actually write it on the inside of this lid. So I will go ahead and do that. I'll actually grab a Sharpie. Okay, perfect. So we'll see if this works. Another method, you could put, I know graphite obviously won't disappear from water and things like that. So you could find a way to write on a piece of paper, maybe, I don't know, maybe laminate it if you're super fancy. I'm gonna try it this way. You could also try taping like a plastic stake on the inside with what you planted. So on the far left, I've got purple coneflower. And then I have foxglove beard tongue. And then the rest are columbine. Nope, that's wrong. Ah, I got those reversed. This is why you write it down, folks, because if you don't, you'll be like me and forget later. Okay, and the rest of those there. Perfect. So any way you can just to mark it, taking notes in a notebook is also great. And if you do that, it's good to write the day, the time of year. So actually we're in January 12th. Let me also write that in there. Okay. Now let's plant one more container, and then we will take these outside and talk more about where to place them and how to sow directly into a garden bed. Okay, so this is a really lovely takeout dish. It's lovely. It's a great size for this type of work. So before I fill it with soil, I do need to punch some holes in the bottom of this. So I'm going to grab my blade here, and I'm just very carefully, oh yeah, that goes through easily, cutting some X's. All across here. And as I pointed out earlier, it already has some holes here in the top, but I will go ahead and put a couple more just so that enough moisture gets into it. So the nice thing about winter sowing is once you've done this process of filling your container with soil and seeding it, you just need to place it outside in an area that will receive any winter rains or snowfall, things like that. So avoid placing them directly against your house because typically it's really dry with that like overhang or soffit. We also recommend you don't plant things right up against your house for that reason too. So anyway, I'll show you more once we go outside. But now I have my holes in this container, and I'm gonna do a slightly different method from last time. And rather than sprinkling different species in smaller amounts as we did in this container, which is good to see just how the different species respond, I'm going to overseed this whole container with one species so that later when they start to germinate or emerge, I can then carefully kind of tangle them or untangle them from each other and transplant them into larger pots so that they can further mature and then be planted into my garden. So I noticed that this soil is a little dry here. So another tip to have when you're doing winter sowing is to make sure that you can moisten your soil a little bit with a squirt bottle. Now you don't want it super wet, but just enough that it's not absolutely powdery and drawing all the moisture out of your skin when you work with it. I think that's kind of a good rule of thumb. So just a light spritz. And again, this is a potting soil mix that we had on hand here at the Discovery Center, which is, honestly what I recommend. Use your recycled old potting soil if you'd like, or get some new potting soil. Typically, like in a greenhouse setting, I wouldn't necessarily recommend you use recycled soil because you can run into insect issues in a very contained environment. So, they lack the biological pressure to keep them in check. But in this case, they're going outside, they're gonna get frozen. I think they'll pretty much be okay, especially if you're then taking them from your containers and putting them into your garden. I think the insects shouldn't be an issue at that point. So I'm gonna go ahead and generously fill this container with soil. Now, folks often ask, well, how deep do you need to plant a seed? Typically, think about this. When seeds fall off a plant, the plant isn't putting them deep in the soil, right? They just fall out of the flower and land on the surface of the soil. So we are going to replicate that. Now, there are two things that will set you up for success with winter gardening, or winter sowing rather. And that is soil contact for your seeds, and again, those cold, moist stratification or cold, moist winter days. Those are the two things you need really to be successful with sowing seeds in winter time. So now I have my soil here. I'm actually gonna go ahead and fill it up a little more, because as you know, it is fluffy, so it will compact as it gets watered. So I mentioned I want to grow a lot of foxglove this year, so I'm gonna go ahead and fill this puppy up. And I'll go ahead and write it first thing so I don't forget 10 seconds after I seed it. Okay. And again, here's that awesome foxglove beard tongue seed. Look at that, it looks just like dried clay. I say that because I'm a ceramic artist. I don't know, yeah, it's really just kind of crunchy looking. So I'm gonna be more generous with this. And I don't know if you'll be able to see exactly where these seeds are falling on the soil, but I'm probably planting hundreds of little plants, or maybe 100 little plants here. So this method, like I don't know, it probably has a technical term, but we call it flatbed growing, or growing seeds in a flat tray, a whole flat. And again, when these all grow up, their roots will be very much tangled. But this method works great for native plants that have fibrous roots. Those fibrous roots, much like hair, you can gently kind of untangle them from each other and plant them into their own separate containers so they get bigger later on, compared to things like milkweed or blazing star, who have those big tap roots, or corms rather. They really hate to be disturbed. So this is probably not the best method for native plants with tap roots, at least not with this container. Now, if you have a deeper container, you could try milkweed, and I know people do it, but it's just more difficult. So feel free to try, of course, but I prefer to direct sow my milkweed seeds into the landscape, which I'll show you more later. Okay, so I sprinkled my seeds on here, and again, I mentioned plants don't plant their seeds, right? They just broadcast them. So I'm just gonna lightly cover them with a little soil. And again, this is just to ensure soil contact. Now, obviously, these seeds are in contact with soil because this is just prepared potting material, and they're not competing with our other existing plants. So since this is a larger space and I'm sowing a larger area, I have also packed the soil down just lightly. Again, that's to ensure that soil contact with the seeds. Okay, so now we have our first 2 containers. So we're gonna take these and some seeds outside to show you how to winter sow directly into a prepared garden bed. Shall we, Ephraim?
Yes, let's go.
Okay. Perfect. All right. So there are a lot of reasons to sow directly into your landscape as well during winter time. One, the snow on the ground will draw the seeds right into the soil, allowing them to make that soil contact and avoid predators like birds who are scavenging for seeds during the winter time. So this is a great time because we just got a ton of snow here in Kansas City, so plenty of opportunity to seed already established landscapes with some more seed. Ooh, it's snowing too. Ooh. I hear we have a polar vortex or something heading our way. So this snow we got recently was so heavy that it pretty much laid down our entire prairie and plantings. So I always talk about winter beauty, but this is a little extreme. So I'm looking forward to when the snow melts a little more and our plants lift up a little bit so we can appreciate it a bit more. But again, it's a great time to sow seeds too. So in this example with our containers, imagine we're in your backyard and there's a garden bed right here. So I'm just gonna take these towards the house, so to speak, and place them in the snow. Again, this is an example where we don't have anything overhanging that would prevent snow from falling on these. So I'll just place them over there, and then I'll show you how we broadcast seed directly into a bed.
Yes.
This looks like a good spot. Now, be sure to tell your coworkers that you didn't put trash in the garden bed. Or your partner, whoever shares the home with you. Okay, so now we're standing in the middle of our backyard prairie here at the Discovery Center. We just exited the classroom doors, and just a week ago, this had so much amazing plants standing up. You can still see a little stand right there. And that's a big reason to leave plants standing over winter. Not that they get smashed, but the fact that they support wildlife. I don't know if you can hear, but there's tons of birds despite the cold, and they're going to those plants and eating the seeds. So you're providing food, you're providing overwintering habitat for pollinators, and when we don't get 5 inches of heavy snow dumped on us, you get beautiful gardens too. So I have some purple coneflower seeds here, like I showed you earlier. And I'm just gonna go ahead and broadcast on this snow. Now, I have a feeling, just with how crunchy it is, that it may not sink as I anticipate, as it would with a fresh snow, but because it's currently snowing and we've got more snow coming today, I'm gonna go ahead and broadcast it and see what happens. So you can see it hits right on the snow. And this will be a perfect opportunity for birds to come eat this. So I have an idea about that. I'll leave some for them, and I'll probably step over the places I broadcasted so some of it gets planted. Now, this is a great way to add diversity to your already established garden beds, but also for brand new beds. And the best way to do it with a prepared bed is to have less plant competition, right? So if you're like, I have a established garden and I hate everything in it, I would cut it down before you start seeding. But in a case where you have a garden that you love, but you're like, man, I'd like to see maybe a little more coneflower, more foxglove, whatever, it's good to come out and occasionally seed into the landscape. And you may not see results immediately in the next year because seeds take a lot of time to grow, right? But over time, you should see an increased diversity of plants in your garden. So I think that's pretty cool. And I know the birds will be happy about this, but I will go ahead and, at least for these, stomp them in so they're a little more disguised and might have a chance to germinate this spring. So let's review. We talked about different ways you can garden in the winter time, and the two most important factors with winter sowing are seed contact with soil and a cold, moist stratification period so that those seeds can freeze, thaw, and spring to life once we have warmer weather. Thanks for joining us today. We're gonna head back inside because it's cold. Thank you. We're jumping into the Q&A now. As I was saying it just before a ghost of me appeared and started talking also, we had seeded into that takeout container with that foxglove beard tongue. And the reason I used that entire flat and sprinkled the entire surface is that particular plant has fibrous roots, which is different than our tap roots like you see in blazing star and milkweed, and therefore are easier to untangle as the seeds grow. So you can try this with certain species, lance leaf coreopsis, purple coneflower, again mentioned the foxglove, but essentially any native plant that has a fibrous root, you can try overseeding the flat, and then as they emerge and lose their truly, or get their true first set of leaves, you can then transplant them into slightly larger containers. Okay, so we're jumping into the Q&A section, and Deanna asked if she wonders if it's too late to start shooting stars in milk jug containers. I would say no. Now, personally, I haven't tried to grow shooting star, though it is a lovely summer prairie plant, or late spring rather. But I would suggest go ahead and get started now. You can, a lot of our native seeds require 8 to 12 weeks of cold, moist stratification, making January the perfect time to get going, especially with all the really cold temps and extra moisture we have. And now, speaking of moisture, someone in the chat asked, or commented rather, that their containers tend to dry out pretty quickly. Now, I have a couple tips for that. When you do your winter sowing, be sure to set them outside away from your house, because oftentimes if we set things right next to the house, that little overhang with the soffit will prevent any rain from reaching your containers. So set them a little further out in the garden bed, but just make sure you let your friend or partner or whoever know, or in my case, coworker, that you didn't just put trash out into the landscape. That has a purpose. And it is important to keep the soil continually moist, because, you know, we do experience drought sometimes in winter. We did last year for sure. And so Sharon is asking if it's best to keep the soil continually moist. I would say you want to start by having your soil not entirely dry when you go to sow your seeds, but setting it out into the landscape and if we're receiving enough moisture, it should be fine. If you aren't sure, you could always maybe set a little bit of snow on top right now, shut the lid, and that'll at least get it started with the moisture. Okay, so I also wanted to mention that so we talked about winter sowing in containers, but this is also a great time of year to go out into the landscape and sow seeds into either newly prepared garden beds or an already established native garden. Now, with an already established garden bed, you have a lot of existing plant competition, and the two most important aspects of winter sowing are soil contact with the seeds and that cold moist stratification period. So if you, in your established garden, there's no bare soil, you could run into issues with germination. But I think it's a great way to use old seed, or if you're trying to slowly increase the diversity of an established garden bed, go out there and sprinkle some seeds. I actually started doing that at the Discovery Center this past month or so, just to see what happens. And again, you may not notice any results in the first year, because as we know, native plants are a long-term goal. With the first year they sleep, second year they creep, and third year they leap. And that's when I'm talking about already established plugs. Now, seeds can take several years in a situation like that where there may be a lot of variables involved with plant competition and whatnot. Now, let's say you were a prepared gardener and you got a garden bed all set up and ready this fall. It's got nice fresh soil, the weeds are all under control, etc. Well, this is a really great time to go out and seed. Now, whenever I talk about designing garden beds, I encourage planning. I encourage starting with plugs because it is much more difficult to identify a tiny seedling compared to an already established plant. So I would recommend that you just keep that in mind. It can get a little tricky if you're seeding a bunch of different things, and they fall where they may, right? So again, it's good to start with established plugs, have a design, but you can go in and add extra diversity or additional plants by sowing directly over the snow. So I'm going to jump into another question here. Oh, and then I guess this is related. Audrey mentioned that they started a new garden bed, threw seeds directly on the ground before Christmas. Awesome. Covered the ground with landscape fabric to prevent birds from eating all the seeds. Was this good or bad for germination or neutral? Landscape fabric is a little tricky. Now, typically you don't want landscape fabric down, and if you're referring to actual weed mat, because that prevents seeds from coming up. Now, if you're talking about a fabric that just holds the soil intact, it could be okay, but just make sure you're using the type that naturally biodegrades, and so we don't add more plastic into the landscape. But I did again in the video I recorded, I talked about how this will also support our birds, because you're sprinkling it onto the snow, which is great because you'll see where the seeds fall. So will the birds. So especially with this hard, crunchy, compacted snow, maybe go back and walk on top of those areas that you seeded so that they maybe get a little more hidden in the snow and have a better chance of that soil contact. But I always like to throw a little bit out for the plants I want to grow and then for the birds so that they have something to eat too, because ultimately my goal is to plant for wildlife. But that can be always tricky if you're trying to get something started and they're eating everything before it gets a chance to get going. Great question. All right. Okay, Darla, this is a great question. Can you place containers on a balcony facing north? How late in the year can you winter sow? So I answered the question about how late in the year. I'd say January, February, you're pushing it. You really don't have a lot of time past January. So I would get going as soon as you can. But you can always try it anyway and push the boundaries, see what works. But for containers on a balcony, absolutely. Just make sure they don't get blown off your balcony. So maybe put some decorative, I don't know, rocks or plants or pots next to them that'll hold them in place, because using plastic tends to be a lot lighter, right? So I would do that. And in regards to facing north, you'll just want to probably use shade plants. Or more shade tolerant species. Now, since you are creating a microclimate in like a little greenhouse environment with these recycled containers, you can push that boundary a little bit, but I don't know that like the full sun species like milkweed would love it since they prefer more sun. But Darla, try it and let me know how it goes. I'd be super curious to hear your process on that. Okay, so Susan, and you might notice I'm just going down the Q&A now, just to check things out. But Susan is asking, sprinkling seeds atop the soil or bury them a bit? Now, that is a great question. And in the video you saw, I was just sprinkling the seed, and we were just about to get to the point of talking about that. So if you imagine how seeds spread or broadcast their seeds, they're not burying them, but a few things are happening. And this doesn't include the seeds like from wild ginger that are buried by ants. That's a whole other topic we'll say for the springtime. But these seeds, when they fall out of, let's say, purple coneflower, the seeds are falling off because goldfinches are eating them and dropping them everywhere, making a mess. Those seeds are just landing on the soil. And I've heard a rule of thumb is you don't plant seeds more than the depth, like you don't plant them deeper than the width of the seed or height, depending on how you look at it. But what I like to do with especially the tinier seeds is sprinkle them on top of the soil. You can sprinkle more soil on top of that, but press down with your hand, and that'll just ensure that soil contact. But again, in a container, when you're winter sowing, it is such a controlled environment, ideally. So you shouldn't have issues with that soil contact. It might be more of an issue of making sure it stays moist through the winter. Okay. So this is a great question from Fawn. They look for native wildflower seed packets at nurseries and garden centers. Are these typically cold stratified? Now, I would say for big box stores, I wouldn't count on it, but I do know at some places like Missouri Wildflower Nursery or Prairie Moon, they do mention whether or not their seeds have been cold stratified or if they require it. And Prairie Moon actually has a handy germination guide that I'll include in the resources following this show, that talks more about that. Because every seed's a little different, but generally a lot of the native plants that are readily available to consumers follow a similar stratification process. Now, there is one plant that doesn't, and I just want to talk about it because we have time. It is Baptisia australis, or blue false indigo. You know, it's, I think, the gateway plant into the native plant world. And this plant is also known as one of Missouri's tumbleweeds. And it does this because the seeds need to be scarified or scratched up, which I think is really cool. So some seeds do require different germination processes, but the ones that I like to winter sow are pretty simple, just because I like to set myself up for success. But if you've experimented with any interesting species, please let us know in the chat. All right. Okay, Kelly wants me to touch on sowing directly into prepared garden beds. We just did, and essentially, again, 2 rules of thumb. You need your seed to contact soil, and it needs to go through 8 to 12 weeks of cold moist stratification. The less competition in a bed, the better. We have an example at the Discovery Center on the north side of the property. And we had just cut down a lot of the material because there was tons of poison ivy and Japanese honeysuckle. It's kind of a problem area we're working on. But I thought it would be a great opportunity, since we had to cut it down early, to go ahead and overseed. Now, I went and cleaned out the entire seed fridge at the Discovery Center and collected lots of odds and ends, but also prairie and glades, or rather prairie and savanna specific plants that should help balance out the diversity in the bed over the years. Okay, So Sherry would like me to suggest a couple of very low maintenance options for winter sowing. They could grow in their special container until they're ready to plop into their final garden bed. This is actually brings up a good point. Another reason I love to winter sow is Mother Nature is doing all the work for you, in that none of these plants will have to be cold hardened off before you add them to your garden, because they've already been out there and used to the environment. So the species that are lower maintenance, I mentioned the three in the show, foxglove beard tongue, columbine, and purple coneflower. Again, you can do lanceolate coreopsis. I've heard rattlesnake master is a fairly easy one. Now, don't forget, with plants like rattlesnake master, milkweed, even blazing star, if they have a taproot, now think of like a carrot, right? Or a corm, think of a bulb. Those are very fragile, and you want to make sure you take care to not accidentally break that taproot when you go to move them into your garden bed or transplant them into a larger container. So just keep that in mind when you do that process. It is a little, requires slightly more nimbleness, and a larger, taller, deeper container will work really well for that as well. And an anonymous attendee asked if winter sowing on top of snow in an established bed eventually works its way down to the soil as the snow melts. That is the idea. So I mentioned, of course, I've mentioned cold moist stratification. I feel like everyone should take a drink now if I say it anymore. But the other benefit of sowing onto snow is that, and being able to see where you're broadcasting, but also as the snow melts, it does exactly that. Anonymous attendee, it draws that seed down into the soil. So that's why I feel like it doesn't hurt to overseed an established garden bed, especially with some of these native plants that are easy to grow from seed, like the ones I mentioned a moment ago. Okay. Would this system help germination rates of wildflower or butterfly mixes that are in packets? It really depends, Sherry. It depends on where you're getting the seeds from. Now, if you are looking to plant true native plants to support wildlife, I always recommend you go to and support our local native plant nurseries. Which I will include in the resources following the show, but it certainly can. And there's other options. Let's actually talk about that. So winter sowing is great for adding new plants to your garden, but you can also, if you don't necessarily want to do that this year, if you have a bunch of seeds, put them in your fridge or your freezer. And that way you get a head start on the next season. That's what we do at the Discovery Center. We actually have a dedicated seed fridge that we store everything. And the occasional sandwich gets in there sometimes, but it's mostly just seed. And that way you don't have to think about it. It's there, it's ready, and you're good to go. And speaking of that, I do want to mention also that there's an easier way to figure out germination rates than the way I showed you. I was thinking about this actually after this after that episode. You can actually test the seeds by taking them and get a wet paper towel, damp, wring it out, place your seeds on there, cover it with the paper towel, put it in a Ziploc baggie, label it, and then stick it in your fridge. And after a few weeks, you can see if your seeds have started to germinate. And so that way you're not putting in all the effort, if that is a concern of yours, putting in the effort to seed all these things and not have it turn out. So if you're ever not sure about if your seeds are still viable, maybe you're like me and you can't help but hoard seeds, then that's a great way to check. One other thing I was thinking about with winter sowing is protecting your plants, your pots rather, from squirrels, chipmunks, birds, the like. Some folks, if they're using an open top, then you can go ahead and place some screen, like window screen on top of it, weigh it down with a couple rocks or bricks, and that'll help prevent those pesky squirrel friends from digging into your pots. Tell me how I know. So those are some of my tips there. And I think that is about all we have time for today. I'm just going to look through one more time to see if there's any other questions I haven't answered. Oh, you know what? There's one more. Well, there's several, and I really appreciate everyone's questions, but one that seems most relevant to our conversation right now is if there are any grasses that go through the same process. And I'm a sedge head wannabe. I love sedges and grasses and the whole, Carex family and all of that, but and graminoids, but I don't know a lot about them. What I do know is I've had good success growing both eyelash grass, which is Bouteloua gracilis, and excuse me, and little blue stem, Schiziocarpum. Nope. Anyway, Sysaccharium scoparium. I'll never get that one right. I can type it, but I can't say it. Anyway, those are two great grasses that I have found that work for growing in the greenhouse. And they're slightly different than how you would grow an herbaceous forb or flower. And that I like to sprinkle several seeds in the center of the pot and let them all grow up together. I don't untangle them into bigger pots later. I just start with a larger pot, seed them in there, and go from there. So give it a try, and I hope you all have enjoyed today's episode of Native Plants at Noon. Thank you for joining us, and be sure to tune in on February 1st for our Lunch and Learn series with Sarah Beyer, native landscape designer and educator with Oak&io. She'll be discussing keystone species that you can add to your garden. We'll see you then. Thanks so much.